Good morning, so you don't feel you're talking into a white wall.
I wanted you to have enough time to have a glass of water or a cup of tea. So, good morning. Today is January 23rd. And it is in the 11 o'clock time in the morning Eastern time. Welcome to the hearings of the International Commission of Inquiry on systemic police violence against people of African descent in the United States. These hearings are a process by which witnesses can present accounts of unjustified killings and maimings of Black individuals by police officers in the United States before an international panel of rights experts. We now begin the hearing in the case of Daniel Prude. My name is Horace Campbell, and I'm the rapporteur for this hearing. Presiding over this hearing today is Commissioner Rashida Manjoo of South Africa, Commissioner Bert Samuels of Jamaica. The witnesses for the hearing are Attorney Donald Thompson and Joseph Prude. Commissioners Rashida Manjoo and Bert Samuels. I'm sorry. There will be 50 minutes for this hearing. Witnesses will testify, followed by a period of questions from the commissioners. I will call time at the 30-minute mark and at the 45-minute mark. Please excuse my interruptions. Commissioners Rashida Manjoo and Bert Samuels, I now present to you the first witness. Attorney David Thompson, please confirm your name.
Yes, it's Donald Thompson. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. Attorney Donald Thompson, please confirm your name.
Yes, it's Donald Thompson.
Do you promise that your testimony to the Commission of Inquiry will be true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, I do.
You may begin.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you, first of all, for inviting us to speak this morning. I'd like to talk about the Daniel Prude case in two parts, basically. First, I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about what happened. And after that, I would like to spend a good deal of time talking about the official response to what happened. And I think you'll see as we go through this process, many parallels with the case that was discussed by Mr. Vaccaro just in the last segment. We, just for a bit of background, are in upstate New York, in Rochester. He's in New York City, but I think you'll see very many of the same issues present here in the Daniel Prude case. To talk about, first of all, what happened, Mr. Prude was residing with his sister in the city of Chicago. He was experiencing some unusual and concerning to his sister mental health issues. She contacted Mr. Prude's brother, Joseph Prude, who is with us this morning and who is prepared to give a victim statement at the end of the presentation, to ask for advice about what should be done. They decided together that it would be best for Daniel Prude, who is Joe's younger brother, to come to Rochester so that Joe could care for him, figure out what was going on, get him appropriate treatment or counseling. So Daniel Prude's sister put him on a train from Chicago to Rochester. Unfortunately, well on the train ride, he experienced some mental health events and was asked to leave the train in Buffalo. So about an hour away from Rochester, Joseph Prude got in the car and went and picked up Daniel at the train station. At which point everything seemed to be fine. They drove back to Rochester. They went to Joseph's house. They spent some time together, and Daniel then continued to have some mental health issues that were obvious to Joseph, nothing that he'd seen before from Daniel, but very concerning. He was worried. He was trying to figure out what to do. He then parted company, just went into a different room for a few minutes from Daniel. And Daniel then left the home. He had been talking about God. He'd been talking about the devil trying to get at him. He'd been talking about some other concerning issues. And as soon as Joe basically took his eyes off him, Daniel ran. He ran from the house. Now it's a cold March night in Rochester. It was sort of raining, snowing, snow on the ground. It was wet. As soon as Joseph figured out that Daniel had left the residence under the circumstances that he had, he tried to address the situation, and he called 911, our emergency response number, to get some assistance, because unlike in New York City, where there's this basic response team or some other option for dealing with people who are in mental crisis, in Rochester, we had nothing other than 911. And of course, when you call 911, the police respond. So Joseph called 911 and let them know what was going on with his brother. In the meantime, Daniel was running through the streets of Rochester, basically disrobing as he was doing so. He had an interaction with a business where he broke a picture window on the front of the business, and he had interaction with a couple of civilians who also called 911. Now, by the time he encountered those civilians, he was completely naked. He'd removed all his clothing. He had no shoes on, and he was basically running down the middle of the road on this freezing, really March, late evening, early morning hours. He then is encountered in that situation by police. They respond to the area where he was last seen. They troll about for a little bit. They relatively quickly encounter him still in the middle of the road, sort of running or walking down the middle of the road, calling out sort of nonsense words, things that don't make any sense. And they then very quickly are able to subdue him. He's compliant with their requests. He's handcuffed behind his back. He is seated on the pavement in the middle of the road as directed by officers. And I think this would probably be a good time for us to take a couple of minutes and view the police video, the body-worn camera video of the attempted arrest of Mr. Prude. So if you could play that now.
Boy, from baby, I mean it. I mean it. I mean it. Them motherfuckers popping willies out. Give me that square. Give me that square, man. I mean, they get these cups. No, give me the mace. Give me the mace. Give me the mace. On my mama blood, they flipping over in her grave. I mean that. God bless y'all, man. Stay on. Let me up. Get the away from baby. In Jesus Christ, I pray. Amen. Scoop praise. Get the away from baby. I mean it. I mean it. I mean it. Them was popping willies out. Give me that square. Give me that square, man. I mean, they get these cups up off me. In Jesus Christ, I pray. Well, get the fuck up. Give me that gun.
Are you on 5?
Give me that gun. Give me that gun, not me. All right. Take this shit off my face.
You're gonna stay down. You're gonna stay down.
All right.
Stay down.
Take this off my face.
No, I got him. I got him. I'm already in it.
Drag me, kill me. And Jesus came out of me.
That's
My
what you're gonna
mama food over like right here, man. No God. I need it. Get that shit out my face, man. Oh, excuse me. Listen. I got stupid.
Stop. Calm down. Stop. Calm down.
Listen.
Calm down, okay?
I mean, get that feet out of me. Get that fool.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my people? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my people? Which side are you on?
I placed a phone call for my brother to get help, not for my brother to get lynched.
I'm already in it.
Drag me, kill me. And Jesus came out of me.
That's
My
what you're gonna
mama food over like right here, man. No, I need it. Get that feet out my face, man. Oh, excuse me. Listen.
All right, thank you. So as you can see from the video, Mr. Prude was completely subdued, seated, handcuffed behind his back in the middle of the road. And like the case that Mr. Vaccaro spoke about, there was no reason why he had to die. It was based upon the impatience of the police. Basically, Mr. Prude died because he wouldn't shut up. He kept yelling things at officers that didn't make any sense, and this agitated them. Why? Because they're not trained to deal with this situation. They don't have the personality type to deal with this situation. They're incapable of dealing with this situation. So you saw the police aggression toward Mr. Prude. Well, he's completely subdued, and after he is seated on the pavement. I don't know if you could see it very clearly from that video, but what actually happens is after he would not be quiet, he's rolled over by police with the spit sock over his head onto his chest, calling out the whole time. There's one officer with his knee in Mr. Prude's back. Another officer is holding his legs. The third officer is doing basically a triangle push-up on the side of Mr. Prude's head. So he's completely immobilized and his chest is compressed to the point where he cannot breathe. He then had, I don't know if it's a heart attack, but his heart stops there at the scene. The thing you don't see is there was a response by medical personnel, EMTs, which is remarkably callous. They are clearly on the same team with the police. They're explaining to the police why it's not their fault that Mr. Prude's heart stopped, that they are diagnosing him with excited delirium, which is nonsense, for one thing, and that this was the cause of the incident. Mr. Prude was then eventually transported by ambulance to the hospital. They attempted to do chest compression at the scene. They failed to basically unhandcuff him from behind his back, which limited the use of the chest compressions. He's transported to the hospital. He was able to maintain a pulse and a heartbeat until he was at the hospital, basically, but was found at that point to be brain dead. And within about 48 hours, the family was given a choice of pulling the plug, and ultimately they did, as there was no hope for recovery. Prude having lost oxygen to his brain for too long a time. So this happened March 30th of 2020. Thereafter, there was no official response. There was no disclosure to the public, and there was no disclosure to the family until we had obtained the body-worn camera video and the other information relating to the police response. And we released it publicly in September. And when that happened, that wound up opening the floodgates as to what had taken place with respect to the police response. The first thing that happened was there was an aggressive disagreement between City Hall and the brass of the Rochester Police Department. The police chief wound up getting fired by the mayor because the contention was that he had not transmitted the information to her about this circumstance. There's currently an exploration of that by City Council. They've hired independent counsel to determine what in fact was true concerning what the mayor knew and when she knew it. The Rochester Police Department investigation, which we learned of after the body-worn camera video was released, had already been conducted, had determined that there was no inappropriate action on the part of the police officers, that all protocols established by the Rochester Police Department had been followed, and that there was no reason for any internal discipline by the police. After the videos were released, and even after that, thankfully in Rochester, we have a very active civil rights protest community. We had a series of civil rights protests over weeks and weeks and weeks. You saw a little clip of one or two of those in the video. The Attorney General's office became involved. There is now an executive order in New York State that requires in police-related deaths, the Attorney General's office, not the local district attorney's office, investigate to determine whether there was inappropriate conduct or criminal activity on the part of police. That investigation in Mr. Prude's case is ongoing. The Attorney General's office has been presenting evidence to a grand jury. There has been no result as of yet with respect to that presentation. The other thing that happened very quickly was a very aggressive and very antagonistic response by the police union. We here as in New York City have a very strong police union, which rather than bargaining for vacation days and pay raises and things like that, is primarily focused on avoiding responsibility of individual police officers. And what turned out to be the case in the theme of avoiding responsibility is these videos, body-worn camera videos and the other evidence that had been obtained with respect to the response in Daniel Prude's case had within 2 to 3 days been forwarded to the police union and had not been forwarded to the family, had not been disclosed to attorneys for the family. We eventually, the way that we got the videos was we filed Freedom of Information law requests with the city, which they denied. We appealed. We had to argue again. We filed another request. They denied. We appealed. And finally, through those foils and through the auspices of the Attorney General's office, not the local authorities, we were able to view the videos of what really happened to Mr. Prude. Never released by the city. Frankly, I think that they were of a mind that, if they just swept this under the rug, it would probably go away. That didn't happen. Let's talk for a second about the protests that followed. The city authorities and the Rochester Police Department, even after the release of the videos, did what they could do, or what they thought they could do, to try to sweep this under the rug and to say, well, move along, nothing to see here. Let's just continue life as usual. Well, you know, our local civil rights protest groups, who, as I said, are very active, we're not having any of that. We had an encampment at one point outside of City Hall for a number of days. We had protests every single night. We had a police response that was exponentially beyond anything relating to a peaceful protest. We had protesters who were struck in the face with fired tear gas canisters. We had some 6,000 rubber bullets fired at peaceful protesters. We had circumstances where protesters were trapped on a bridge by police and sniped at with rubber bullets. We had police officers acting, and we have other video of this as well, acting as antagonists toward protesters to try to provoke physical violence or confrontations. They were of a very defensive stance, a very offended stance. You'll see, I think, in a couple of the little shots in that video clip, you know, the police officers are out there in riot gear, riot shields, with, you know, all kinds of to address the largely peaceful protesters. You saw in the front lines the protesters in one part of the clip with umbrellas. Very ingenious on their part, because police officers were firing at them, and they used the umbrellas to deflect tear gas canisters, pepper balls, and rubber bullets. So in regard to the police response, to show how completely incapable they are of objectively examining their own conduct and addressing it, we now, in addition to, you know, everything else that's going on, represent roughly, I've lost count actually, but it's roughly 100 protesters who suffered fairly significant injuries from the police as a result of the police response. And by the way, they brought in assistant police agencies from across New York State to assist with this response. They had people from as far away as Watertown, Lake Placid, state police, U.S. federal marshals. They would take people and arrest them and have them spirited away to an unknown location where they could not have contact with counsel. Every kind of aggressive response that you could really imagine. One of the things that's happened now, and it just got named a couple of days ago actually, is Rochester has instituted a person in crisis team to respond in circumstances like this, largely because of this case, in circumstances like this, where a police response is really not appropriate. And here, we did not have the resources that New York City has, but we did have a forensic mental health unit and a mental health crisis team. Unfortunately, here, the person who headed up the mental health crisis team, who has since been fired, had conveyed private medical records concerning Mr. Prude directly to the police department, the police brass, so that they could construct their response and sort of circle the wagons, which is, it's probably something that went on all the time, but we didn't know of it until this case, when we got the disclosure about the police response post Mr. Prude's death. The other thing that happened with respect to the police response, and Mr. Vaccaro mentioned this sort of thing in his presentation, was they immediately tried to paint Mr. Prude as at fault for his own circumstances. There's a particular police report by one of the officers, actually, I think it's the guy who was doing the triangle push-up on Mr. Prude's head, who characterized Mr. Prude in the police report as a suspect. A suspect for what? You know, he was suspected of being a victim of police abuse at that point, but he was not a suspect with regard to any other investigation or any other criminal activity. So they tried to basically flip the script to make it look as though, you know, Mr. Prude was a violent fellow who, you know, had nothing to complain about with respect to the police treatment. They also focused on this excited delirium from the very first moments when the EMTs went out or were at the scene until their public responses after the videos were released. Now, excited delirium is a diagnosis, if you will, that was created out of whole cloth by Vincent DeMaio, a forensic pathologist, some 15 to 20 years ago. He has since disavowed the concept of excited delirium, that this is just, it's nonsense. He made it up without any testing, without any basis in scientific fact. But they used this excited delirium as a justification for the police response. But you saw the video, you saw how Mr. Prude was already restrained, how he was physically compliant with each of the officers' requests, and the officers just weren't trained to handle this type of thing. I mean, I think, you know, in the traditional police officer training, what are they taught? Well, they're taught that it's most important for us to get home for dinner with our families, you know, and if anybody stands in the way of that, you know, we have the means to exercise the force necessary to make sure we get home for dinner. So, you know, it's a lot of, in the traditional police setting, us versus them. And it's not us versus them when the them, here Mr. Prude is experiencing a mental health crisis and is not complying with every one of the officers' directions, to which the officers take offense, which results in an aggressive response. Same thing with the protests afterwards, which were a very good example of officers unable to brook any criticism whatsoever concerning their activities or their response. And Rochester, you should know, is a city that has a serious problem with racism. We have one of the lowest high school graduation rates in the country. We have a very large, underprivileged, poor community. We are still tremendously segregated by way of city versus suburb. And I think you can see in many of these circumstances, Mr. Prude's included, a response based in part on either extrinsic or internal racism. If you think back to that video, you know, just imagine, if you will, what would have taken place if the man on the ground was white and if the men standing around him were black. Would we have the same result? We absolutely would not. And would we have the same cover up? No, we would not. So, you know, the failure to address that by our city administration, who, by the way, is almost uniformly black or minority, is not solely racism, but it's relating to the power structure. You know, those with power versus those without. The other problem that we have in Rochester is we have had, up until now, really, until the last year or two, we've had a vacuum in attorneys who will bring civil rights claims against the police department or the city in circumstances like this. So there's been very little accountability, certainly no self-accountability on the part of who recall conducting this investigation. All the appropriate protocols were followed. So I don't know if somebody had a question there. I might have talked over the top of somebody.
We have passed the 30-minute point.
Okay. All right. So, you know, one of the things that continues to be ongoing here, in addition to the criminal investigation by the Attorney General's office relative to the police officers who were involved, there's a civil action by Mr. Prude's estate to attempt to also ensure that all of the information comes out, that there be accountability here for the officers' actions. There is the ongoing city council investigation concerning the city hall and police cover-up. And we have here, by the way, in Rochester, a citizens review board that was initially put into place after many years attempting to put in place some kind of police accountability board staffed by civilians, which has been vociferously opposed by the local police union. Eventually, you know, we were able to pass the local legislation necessary for a police accountability board. Immediately, the police union brought an action in Supreme Court to limit the authority and the ability and the budget of the Police Accountability Board. And that litigation is ongoing. So the Police Accountability Board, although in place at the moment, just recently within the last 6 months, has been effectively hobbled by the litigation initiated by the police union. So, I mean, one of the questions or one of the topics discussed with Mr. Vaccaro was the power and the authority of police unions. And, you know, this is one of my particular pet peeves. I think things are not going to get better. Change is not going to be possible until the police unions are limited in their authority to defend the actions of individual officers, particularly in regard to cases like this, where there is a criminal investigation into the actions of those officers. So, you know, I think it's an ongoing structural problem. In no other case does a union exercise that type of authority or that type of really cover for police unions. I'll second the comments by Mr. Vaccaro concerning investigations that are done internally where police officers are entitled to union representatives who, you know, in that circumstance will offer their own testimony or become, you know, very aggressive in the defense of police officers where the idea is simply to flesh out the facts, determine what happened. They will act as the first and most aggressive representative of the police officers. You know, the other thing here, I think structurally that needs to be done and has not been done even after all of the protests and after all of the videos that were released concerning Mr. Prude's case is this internalized structural racism that we have in Rochester, which is just intransigent. It's something that is just part of the fabric of our community. And until it's acknowledged, for one thing, which it has not been, it cannot be addressed and ameliorated for another thing. And, you know, that I'm hopeful that as we continue to go through the litigation, the various litigations concerning Mr. Prude's case and the protests that followed and the objections to the official response attempting to basically sweep everything under the rug, that there will be that kind of acknowledgement and there can be that type of accountability. But I haven't seen it yet. And, you know, the parties involved have been more interested to this point in defending their own positions and explaining why whatever they did wasn't wrong. But we have to get beyond that. And I'm hopeful that some of these investigations will lead to reports that will allow for systemic change. We have, you know, trouble in City Hall as well. The mayor is up for re-election next year and is currently a defendant in her own criminal prosecution with respect to fraudulent election practices. So we need some change, and it's unfortunate that a circumstance like this has to be the catalyst for that kind of change. But hopefully, you know, if nothing else, it will be. Hopefully, if nothing else, the person in crisis team that's been put in place now will result in people like Joseph Prude never having to be placed in the position that Mr. Prude was placed in, to call police who were not trained or equipped to respond to his brother's circumstance because help was needed and there was no one else to call. He did the best that he could, but our resources were limited in such a way that the response here, there was no chance that there was going to be an appropriate response to Mr. Prude's circumstances other than happenstance. Had we had an officer with some appropriate outlook or appropriate training responding, perhaps things could have been different, but that training's not offered, and it's not mandated, and it's certainly not taken to heart in the Rochester police force. That's not their culture. So with any luck, this will result in some modifications to the culture of the Rochester Police Department, the culture of the Rochester City authorities concerning acknowledging issues like this rather than trying to avoid or deny or minimize issues like this. Like I echo again what Mr. Vaccaro had said in Sharice's case. In this case, there was no reason why Mr. Prude had to die. It was solely based upon the impatience of police officers. What, again, if you think back to the video, what would have happened had each of those police officers, instead of confronting Mr. Prude and physically engaging him, what would have happened if they all just took a step back? Nothing would have happened. If they needed backup, they're fully capable of calling backup. You know, if because he's a large fellow, you need somebody else to help lift him into the EMT's van because he's obviously in crisis and needs some treatment, why not wait for that other person to respond? Why do you have to aggressively interact with him? Well, because you're a police officer and he's not following your instructions. And that, without more, I mean, we kind of, there's nothing funny about this situation, but in the criminal defense area, sometimes we joke about the non-existent penal law offense of criminally pissing off a police officer. Well, this is really what happened in Mr. Prude's case. He had no other offense that he had committed that police officers were aware of other than he wouldn't be quiet. They told him, and if you see the entire series of videos, they tell him in a number of ways and on a number of occasions to be quiet. And he's in mental health crisis and he wouldn't be quiet. But what does it hurt? So what if he's yelling out into the air? It was offensive to those officers. So I think I've covered sort of the topics that I'd like to cover. I'll be happy to entertain any questions that you have.
Thank you. Commissioners, would you want me to swear in the next witness, or would you want to question Attorney Donald Thompson?
I would prefer hearing the next witness in the interest of time.
Okay.
I agree.
Thank you very much. Commissioners Rashida Manjoo and Commissioner Bert Samuels, I now present to you the second witness, Joseph Prude.
I'm here.
Joseph Prude, please confirm your name.
Joseph Prude.
Do you promise that your testimony to the Commission of Inquiry will be true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, I do.
You may begin.
Well, on the night in question, like I said in the previous interviews and all, I called for my brother to be helped, not for my brother to be mocked, tortured, whatever the case may be. As you see in the videotapes, as you can see back to when he was first apprehended by the police in Lackawanna, they didn't see no problem, where they had to initiate forceful, tactics against him. They called me and told me, your brother's here. He got kicked off the train. Like my lawyer said, I drove the hour and a half to go pick him up. And in the process, me picking him up, everything was okay. Got here, and, had a little time with each other, and things took a turn that I didn't understand. And me coming to the terms where I need to call these people and see if I can get my brother some professional help, because I never dealt with nothing like that. And me knowing at that particular time that when I first admitted him, they released him in 3 hours. No phone call to the family, no justification of why they released him. And 3 hours later, he's back off to the same. He started talking about this, started talking about that. And that really had me worried all over again. Like, man, what am I supposed to do? So I called again when he vanished out my back door. So me calling again, I'm in the process at the same time. I done ran out of here in my socks and jumped in my car riding around looking for him, right along with the police. And in the process of me riding around trying to find the location where my brother is at, I was threatened with being locked up if I don't go back in the house and let them deal with the situation at hand. So that brought me forth to call my lawyers. And when I came to realization that something harmful had happened to him that night, I don't know if it was just my gut feeling, but I called Donald's associate the next morning because I had major crimes and all this. The investigator showing up. The first investigator that showed up told me he died on the scene. He regurgitated in the street his heart stopped. Now, that's what prompted me to call my lawyer's associate. Now, when I called my lawyer's associate, in the process of me calling my lawyer's associate, I had 2 more major crimes detectives come to my house and tell me my story don't add up about me admitting my brother to the hospital. Now, in the process of me admitting my brother to the hospital, I'm telling them how my story don't add up. My story adds up perfectly. When I said all I did was call to get my brother some help. Now, y'all coming and questioning me like I did something to my brother. So everything came out, like my lawyer said, the freedom of law information request. And several occasions, they denied us. And when they finally gave it to us, I talked to my sister, I talked to my dad, you know, do y'all want me to let the media see what these people done to my brother? My father told me, go ahead. My sister told me to go ahead. So that prompted me to speaking out at the press conference and telling them, you know, I knew from past, not need so much as past experience, but things that has taken place over here in Rochester, where the police get involved and take things a little too far. And I don't know what set with me, and I knew it. So at the press conference, like I said, I called for my brother to get some help, and not to turn around and have my brother lynched by the people that's supposed to protect and serve us. Now, if I'm sitting here witnessing the brutality that they're displaying to the community, not just me being a black man and not just my brother being a black man, those of a poor class of individuals from a certain community that's being mocked, ridiculed, tortured, killed, slayed, lynched. And me knowing this and me speaking about it, you know, all I can ask is that, why did he have to die when he didn't do nothing wrong to nobody? He complied with everything. He did everything that they asked him to do. Y'all got any questions that y'all really want to ask me, please do.
Thank you. We've passed the 45-minute mark.
Okay.
May I jump in here and just give my condolences to you, Sir Purge, about your brother. As you said, you called for protection and help. But your attorney, may I just ask your attorney a question regarding all the problems surrounding the systemic problems, from police unions down to the collaboration with the press and trying to investigate the grieving brother at the same time. What's your, Attorney Thompson, what's the likelihood, in your view, from 1 to 10 of criminal proceedings with the pressure that has come from the public and the protesters? What's the likelihood of criminal proceedings being initiated, even for manslaughter?
I think from 1 to 10, I think the likelihood now, because of the dissemination of the videos and the involvement of the Attorney General's office, is probably about 7 or an 8. I think absent the protests that we had and the very active public response, the likelihood would have been 0.
And to his brother, how did you feel when you saw what happened at the Capitol on the 6th of January to the persons who were actively involved in criminal activity and how they were treated versus persons who protested on your brother's behalf? How did you feel when law enforcement stood back and allowed the Capitol to be criminalized?
Oh, how I felt about that? It's like I knew right then and there when I seen them storm that Capitol that this is something that we've been doing for centuries. That, you know, it's always going to be black and it's always going to be white. Now, if there was black people that stormed that Capitol, everybody that stormed in that through that door, that was if that was a black male, black female, they would have been hurt. They
Okay.
got the worst treatment than them people got, that they just, and I say it again, systematic racism, then it's not going to change unless we
Okay,
can. Thank you.
Thank you, my brother.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson and Mr. Prude, and my condolences to you and your family, Mr. Prude. Watching the video is horrific. And, you know, I couldn't make sense that you had 7 police officers surrounding your brother, a naked man with the mental health problems lying on the floor in winter. And it boggles the mind to think that one cannot, as law enforcement, think of ways to protect the dignity of people, the safety of people, and to do their jobs in a way that respects the humanity of another individual. The joking that is going on. So 3 people are physically on your brother. The other 4 are standing around joking. And it kind of boggles the mind. And Mr. Thompson, in a document, a summary document that we received in addition to the larger document, you highlight for us the systemic problems in Rochester, which you've also highlighted now in your testimony. And you name police officers. So these are known, it's like a rogues gallery. The names are there, the faces are there, you know who these people are. And it really reinforces the structural systemic nature of the problem, the kind of disconnect between Black and white people, the disconnect between the governance structures, and if I'm not mistaken, you said the governance structures are mainly Black, and it raises a whole issue of the class system. So we're not only talking about race now, we're also talking about the class divide in Rochester, which is deeply troubling. And, so it's like common knowledge who the cowboy that you described, the policeman that actually thinks it's affirming to be called the cowboy. So the patterns of behavior that go on. And for me, it was really awful to watch how 7 police officers surround a naked man with mental health problems. The issue of the mayor now and whether there was collusion, what did she know, what she didn't know, is another issue that comes up. There was a time when the police officers asked him if he was HIV positive. And then there was a discussion about whether, and we're talking March 2020, about COVID. And the question that comes to mind in light of over 410,000 people dying in your country, the behavior of police when arresting or trying to forcefully subdue someone, the issue of COVID is going to come up. Has it come up in the last 10 months in a way where the brutality and the force forms part and parcel of the fear, having 410,000 people die? Whether you've seen any cases, and that's, goes to the issue of people's own stigma and how they stigmatize other people, etc. And then the issue of the protesters. And I'm glad that you are taking that issue up as well for injuries suffered for police brutality when there was a lawful protest against an injustice and a lack of accountability. Are the protesters experiencing harassment subsequent to this becoming now a legal matter? And how do you deal and how do they deal with this? Thank you. I know I conflated a whole lot of issues there. Thank you.
Yes, let's talk about the COVID first of all. You'll note that in the protest videos that we see, which is several months later, it's in September at earliest, by the way, the police officers are not wearing masks in almost uniformly, and still are not wearing masks almost uniformly. I think there's a large culture of denial in the police force. I question the legitimacy of any concerns that they supposedly had about COVID at this early date. You saw that none of the police officers out at the scene were wearing masks. So I think it was more about, what can we do to address our own protection here, to act as cover, basically, if you will. Are people being subjected to special treatment, if you will, by police because of their activities in these protests? Yes, most definitely. I mean, as the protests continued, the police response became more violent. As the protests continued, the police gradually were able to identify who some of the organizers were and would target them. And they did. Some of the organizers or the people who were involved in disseminating the word about protests have been arrested 4 or 5 or 7 times during the course of the protests, because the police, after a time would go straight for them because those were essentially the targets. Yes, I mean, there has been an organized, aggressive, inappropriate police response. It reminds me of a gang, basically, of a police response where, if there has been criticism of police activities or particular police officers, they will respond, exponentially more. They took to, during the protests, many of the officers to covering their badges so that they could not be identified. They did eventually begin wearing either face shields or masks. I think more because they didn't want to be identified than anything else. But yes, their response to what they perceive as criticism of police activities has been aggressive toward the civilians and has escalated as the protests have continued.
Thank you. And Mr. Prude, have you and your family experienced harassment by the police? Because you've been very visible and vocal and are participating in different public activities. Have you or your family experienced hostility and a backlash?
No, not since they know Donald Thompson is my lawyer. I haven't experienced no backlash at all.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Can I ask one last question, Mr. Thompson? In terms of the racial demographics in the police force, what is the percentage offhand in terms of Black police officers in the force? And if you had more representativity, would it make a difference?
I think informally, I think the percentage is about, say, 10 to 15% of Black, maybe slightly larger if you include minority officers. There has been an aggressive attempt to increase minority representation on the police department. But frankly, I don't think that a larger percentage of Black or minority officers is the solution. I think it's more a power issue than it is a race issue when you're dealing with police officers. And some of the worst offenses by the most aggressive police officers are committed by minority officers. And as you said, as you mentioned, it's no secret who these officers are. We have basically a rogues gallery of those officers who routinely exercise physical force far above and beyond anything that's called for. And there is a decent percentage of those officers who are minority officers. So I don't think it's simply the minority issue. I think it's more a power issue.
Is it power in terms of hierarchy and status within the police service force? I mean, I'm trying to understand your notion of power.
I think it's power more in the us versus them sense. And perhaps with the minority officers, there's a little bit more of the desire to be perceived as belonging to the us group as opposed to the them group. And maybe a little bit more aggressive response because of that to demonstrate their bona fides basically as a member of the group.
Thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. This concludes the hearing of the case of Daniel Prude. The hearings will resume on Monday, 25th of January. Thank you very much.
Thank you
all.